Millions pass through Times Square every year without ever thinking about what lies beneath it. And most of them would be surprised to find out that this place wasn't built on solid ground. It rose on unstable marshland, terrain so unreliable that even America's earliest inhabitants avoided settling there altogether. Yet today, that same land is packed to the limit. Beneath the streets, utility corridors sit above subway tunnels, steam pipes run alongside bygone mail tubes, and everything above ground depends on what's buried below it. So, how did a swamp become one of the most engineered and famous intersections on Earth? Stay tuned to find out as we uncover what's beneath Times Square. I'm your host, Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. To understand what's beneath Times Square today, we need to go back to when this land was still a swamp. The earliest known records of the area date back to the 17th century, when Dutch colonists first explored Manhattan and noted a wetland valley in the area. When we compare historic maps to today's street grid, we can see that several freshwater streams once converged near what is now 10th and 40th Streets. The Dutch called this creek the Great Kill. The stream wound through a low-lying marshy area known as Reed Valley, which was said to have been rich in game. From there, it emptied directly into a deep inlet of the Hudson River near modern-day 42nd Street. And so, based on this convergence, we can see that Times Square was founded in a non-obvious location. This kind of terrain was poorly suited for settlement, which is why only European settlers equipped to engineer and reshape the land eventually built here. Thus, only in the colonial era do we find archaeological traces of the first settlement in what became Times Square, though there are also some documents. More specifically, we know that in the 18th century, this tract of land was part of the estate of John Moran Scott, a prominent New York lawyer and Revolutionary War general. Scott's manor house was situated near present-day West 43rd Street on high ground overlooking his fields, which back then were used for general agriculture and horse breeding. Remember that last part for later. After Scott passed away in 1784, his land holdings were eventually sold, but his chosen business activities would live on to define this part of New York City in a major way. You see, by the early 1800s, the farm was purchased by an English-born brewer who maintained the land as a county farm. Rather than subdividing it, he preserved the land as an open farm on the city's northern edge. From there, the estate became known as Eden Farm. It covered roughly 22 acres, spanning between 41st and 46th, and then between Broadway and the Hudson River. Though financial troubles forced the sale of this land in 1803, when the property was purchased at foreclosure by real estate investor John Jacob Astor for roughly $25,000. By 1814, newspaper advertisements described the area as having just 2 dwellings and 2 barns. But that wouldn't remain the case forever, since Astor had different plans. He began selling off individual lots as the city's growth pushed northward. And this is the point where the very first seeds of what became Times Square were planted. As the land was gradually developed, some of the first underground spaces appeared. Small cellars, wells, and outhouses, most of which would later be lost. At the same time, the natural watercourses were also about to disappear underground, since they were filled in as the land was graded for new streets and residential blocks. Early efforts were sporadic, but in 1847, the swampy ground at 41st Street had to be raised by more than 10 feet to meet the new street grade. This marked the first major buried artifact under Times Square. I'm talking about the original riverbeds of the marshlands and the Great Kill. All of them were filled in, but they never really disappeared. Instead, they were absorbed into the city's growing infrastructure. Take West 42nd Street, for example, which follows the Great Kill's historic drainage path. In this area, engineers chose to replace natural creeks with a man-made corridor for runoff and wastewater. And by the late 19th century, additional sewer lines were also installed along the route, taking advantage of the valley's natural downhill slope. With planners satisfied and business on the rise, the area became known in the 1870s as Longacre, which was the original name for Times Square. Do you guys remember how the original landowner chose to breed horses on his estate? Well, by the late 19th century, that idea caught on, and the West 40s became New York City's horse and carriage hub. And the city was on board with that idea, to the point that in 1872, the area was formally renamed Longacre Square, a nod to London's Long Acre, intended to lure carriage trade uptown. The marketing worked, and related businesses followed. Livery stables, blacksmiths, carriage manufacturers all set up shop there. There was immense opportunity in the market, as at its peak, New York City alone supported nearly 5,000 stables. And it's here that Long Acre Square really started to come into its own. As businesses grew, urban buildings began replacing farmlands in the mid to late 19th century. During this period, new forms of underground spaces began to emerge. In specific, the sidewalk vaults. Many early commercial buildings extended masonry chambers beyond their foundations and beneath public sidewalks. This created underground storage areas for things like coal or boiler access, and it also facilitated deliveries. In some cases, the point of delivery was marked by a so-called coal hole cover, a type of manhole used to deposit deliveries directly into an establishment via a portal in the public sidewalk. By the late 19th century, other large utility tunnels followed. Water mains were installed beneath major streets like Broadway and West 42nd Street. These were fed by the Croton system to supply buildings and street hydrants. Then, they were soon joined by gas mains which powered street lamps and replaced the earlier oil-based systems. Though they didn't always have to build more infrastructure, as these pipes were typically installed within the same corridors already occupied by sewers or water lines, and this took advantage of earlier grading and drainage work. However, by the end of the 19th century, early electrical systems were added alongside, and these required a dry environment. The cables were routed through shallow underground trenches alongside existing utilities, and it was legally mandated, since New York had actually banned the whole mess of above-ground wiring. So with that in mind, telegraph and telephone lines would come to occupy many of the same conduits that electric used. But then, yet another major subsurface system joined the web of Long Acre Square. This one required digging. I'm talking about New York's first centralized district steam network. Established in 1882, it carried high-pressured steam through buried mains to heat large buildings and power mechanical systems. Consequently, as commercial development pushed uptown, steam pipes were installed beneath major midtown streets, including Broadway and West 42nd. And I need to emphasize that the system was revolutionary, since it eliminated the need for individual boilers, meaning that whole mess of smog could be slightly reduced. Though largely invisible, this steam network became a critical, if not iconic, component of the square's underground environment, enabling the commercial expansion that would emerge in the 20th century. And emerge it would, but this part is a bit ironic. With the carriage trade booming, the masses were coming to the area, and so cable cars were introduced along Broadway to move commuters more quickly. And to be fair, we should add that this new system also introduced some underground elements, such as channels for moving cables and then later, live wires. But that's not the point, since more importantly, they were the first form of rapid transit to set the stage for the square's turning point. The first domino fell when one of the district's most prominent institutions, the American Horse Exchange, founded by William Vanderbilt, announced its closure. Management recognized a crucial fact. If the cable car had already damaged the carriage trade, a new subway line, the one that was announced, with a planned stop in the heart of Long Acre Square, would finish the business off. In response, they made a decision that would redefine the district. Long story short, they had their former site repurposed as the Winter Garden Theater, and it would only be the start of a completely new trend. Since, as you know, their prediction proved timely. Between 1900 and 1904, New York began installing its subways. Engineers excavated cut-and-cover tunnels beneath Broadway and 42nd, threading the interborough rapid transit line directly into the heart of the square. The resulting station, now Times Square 42nd Street, sat just below the intersection, connecting north-south service under Broadway and then east-west beneath 42nd. From the outset, the station included underground passageways that would also allow passengers to move between platforms without even needing to return to street level. And this established one of the city's earliest large-scale pedestrian tunnel networks. Indeed, this was to be the biggest addition to what's below Times Square. And it warrants mentioning that this new subterranean circulation transformed the surface above. By the 20th century, Longacre Square was poised to become what we know it as today. Following the example of the Winter Garden Theater, more similar establishments began to appear. Newspapers at the time described the district as, quote, ablaze with electric lights, and its streets were crowded nightly with theatergoers arriving by subway. And many of these visitors were from out of town. So to accommodate them, the Pabst Hotel rose on a triangular site at 42nd Street between Broadway and 7th Avenue. And though modern, it proved to be short-lived, as its land was coveted by those who are out to shape public perception far more than the theater could. I'm talking about the media. With Longacre Square now being the cultural center of New York, a decision was made that the skyline needed to be reshaped, and the name needed a new distinction. Eager to assert its authority over the public narrative, the Times newspaper established its headquarters right in the square, dominating the skyline in the process. That same year, the city officially renamed Longacre Square to Times Square. This transformation, perhaps more than anything before it, was explosive, as with the voice of the media amplifying the location, a construction boom followed. But remember, this was a wetland just 2 centuries ago, and many of the realities in terms of the difficulty of setting up a civilization there were still very much real. For example, basements and foundations were built below the water table, and they required complex and very expensive pumping systems to manage groundwater and seepage. And many of these buildings were ultimately connected to the transit tunnels, which also needed pumping systems of their own. This created a patchwork layered environment of utility and accessibility, though any traces of the area's earlier landscape were now gone. Times Square had entered its modern identity, an identity made possible by what happened below it. In the years to follow, additional rail lines were planned and constructed around the original rapid transit tunnels. Specifically, under the deal contracts of 1913, competing operators added new subway systems, dramatically reshaping the underground. Then, between 1917 and 1919, the Broadway line platforms were constructed beneath the square, adding deeper tunnel levels and new stations adjacent to the original 1904 infrastructure. These additions enhanced the area into a multi-line interchange, with stacked tracks and platforms occupying different depths below the street. From there, as subway lines multiplied, so too did the need for more underground pedestrian space. So new passageway, mezzanines, and transfer corridors were excavated to connect the growing number of platforms. At the same time, some areas beneath the square began to fall into neglect. For example, in 1918, when the city reorganized subway service into the so-called H system, the original through tracks beneath 42nd Street were converted into a dedicated 42nd Street shuttle. And this, curiously, left behind a sealed trackway, shortened platforms, and structural remnants. Oh, and I almost forgot that around this time, the city's underground pneumatic mail system was at its peak, and a key hub of this activity was Times Square Station Post Office on West 39th. Though invisible from the surface, these tubes formed a massive citywide underground communication system that remained in use until the mid-20th century. So with subway tunnels crossing at multiple levels, mail tubes running in every direction, utility corridors threaded between them, and deep building basements filling the remaining space, it's safe to say that Times Square's underground had become one of the most complex, layered environments in the United States. By the early 1920s, expansion gave way to reconfiguration. Existing underground spaces were repurposed rather than replaced. That process, though, stalled with the onset of the Great Depression, a period that generally proved to be very trying for Times Square's reputation. Back above ground, Times Square survived by catering to mass audiences, a shift that would later open the door to cheap thrills and a more adult-oriented kind of environment. And unfortunately, this was really the only way forward. And it worked. The district stayed bright and busy, but the emphasis shifted from prestige to volume. And as the story unfolded, Times Square became known for cheap, accessible distraction, and that's to put it politely. And with this more gritty reputation did come a wider form of accessibility. Theaters were expensive, but movie theaters, not so much, especially the adult kind. Which is why when the masses were beginning to pay attention to the square, the stage was set. Years passed like this, and the reputation set in, but then the entire world was going to see the square. On August the 14th, 1945, Times Square became the site of one of the most famous public celebrations and photographs in American history. The photograph, captured by Alfred Eisenstein and published in Life, showed a sailor kissing a woman in the crowd. This photograph would go on to be reproduced as a symbol of victory and the essence of returning home, both of which were notions that strongly resonated with the American zeitgeist. This single photo, perhaps more than anything else, put Times Square on the next level of mainstream recognition. Though, as crowds surged, the economy never really caught up, and the businesses continued leaning into forms of lower entertainment. By the mid-1960s and 70s, West 42nd Street, or the Deuce as it was known back then, became synonymous with erotic cinemas and the adult business, ventures that seemed to amplify things like crime. In turn, that encouraged disinvestment. The district's cultural turn grew rougher, far removed from its earlier heyday in horse carriages or the theater business. Though to be fair, this was generally how New York City functioned as a whole back then. The city had hit rock bottom. The modern reinvention of Times Square began in the 1990s with the creation of the nonprofit New 42nd Street, formed to reclaim and restore the district's long-neglected historic theaters. Backed by the city and state, the effort aimed to replace decades of decline with large-scale cultural and commercial investment. The turning point came in the mid-1990s, when Disney committed to restoring the New Amsterdam Theater. Completed between 1995 and 97, the project was widely seen as a signal that Times Square was once again safe and profitable. That ship was further reinforced in 1997 when MTV opened its studio at One Astor Plaza. Broadcasting daily from Times Square, the network turned the district itself into a global media backdrop, projecting its revival to millions of viewers worldwide and in real time, much like the New York Times had done almost a century ago. And it was these moves that brought the square's transformation from a troubled entertainment district into a carefully curated broadcast spectacle. Below the square today, the core systems of transit remain, as previously discussed, though some additional underground spaces have been adapted for public use. I'm talking about commerce and cultural expression. Within the Times Square 42nd Street subway complex, small-scale retail kiosks began selling food, newspapers, and other convenience items. At the same time, the underground has become a site for public art. Through the Metropolitan Transportation Authority's Arts and Design program, permanent displays have been installed throughout the station's complex. Notable examples include Jacob Lawrence's glass mosaic murals depicting the history of Harlem and Nick Cave's Each One, Everyone, Equal All, a large-scale mosaic unveiled in 2021 along the 42nd Street shuttle passageway. And so that, my friend, is what's below Times Square. I really hope you enjoyed the episode. Otherwise, until next time, this is Ryan Socash, signing off.